Hanlonian and Victorianischen Zeitalter. This is a look at marriage and love in Victorian life from 1837 to 1901. Marriage in Victorian times was an institution governed by strict rules and regulations dictated by religious, moral, and class-based expectations. Although the era was marked by significant literary works that celebrated romantic love such as Wuthering Heights or Jane Eyre, the reality of marriage and courtship during this period was far more complex than the idealized versions portrayed in novels. So let's dive into it. First off, let's talk about the purpose of marriage. Why do people do it? Well, in Victorian England, marriage was not just about love, although that might seem hard to believe. It was primarily seen as a means to fulfill social and economic duties, and these duties varied depending on your class. Among the middle and upper classes, marriage was a strategic alliance, a way to consolidate wealth and power through family ties. Marrying someone with similar social status and financial means was highly encouraged. The focus was on creating a prosperous union that would maintain or enhance the family's economic position. At the same time, marriage also played a crucial role in upholding respectability and social order. It was believed that a stable and respectable society depended on the moral behavior of its members. And what was more moral than being married? Being unmarried carried a heavy social stigma, especially for women, who were expected to remain unmarried until they were settled, meaning they had found a suitable husband. That's why we have terms like spinster or old maid to describe an unmarried woman, which were considered derogatory and carried negative connotations. On the other hand, a woman who married was seen as having fulfilled her purpose. Marrying outside one's station, which meant marrying someone of a lower or higher social class, was generally frowned upon. For example, a wealthy businessman might not want his daughter to marry a poor artist because it would be considered a misalliance. Now, of course, there were exceptions to this rule, but they were more common in literature than in real life. And those cases were often marked by social disapproval or even ostracism. As for the lower classes, marriage was still important for economic reasons and social order, but it was not as much about maintaining wealth or status. It was about creating a stable family unit for working-class individuals. The emphasis was on practicality and finding a partner who could contribute to the economic well-being of the household. During the Victorian era, the ideal of the angel in the house became a dominant representation of the expected role and behavior of women. This ideal portrayed women as pure, pious, passive and domestic figures who were responsible for managing the household, caring for children, and maintaining a harmonious family environment. This image of the woman as a kind of heavenly being confined to the domestic sphere was not only reflected in literature, but also permeated social norms and expectations. The cult of domesticity elevated the home as a sanctuary, and women as the chief architects of its sanctity. But don't get it twisted. We will go into more detail about the life of a Victorian wife later in the video. Now let's talk about how marriages were arranged and negotiated. In most cases, marriages during the Victorian era were not a matter of chance encounters or whirlwind romances. They were often the result of careful planning and negotiation between families, especially among the middle and upper classes. While romantic love was certainly valued, it was not the primary consideration when arranging a marriage. Instead, factors like social status, wealth, age, and reputation played a significant role. Parents had a considerable say in the choice of their children's partners, and wealthy families often employed the services of professional marriage brokers to find suitable matches. These brokers had extensive networks and knowledge of eligible bachelors and bachelorettes and their families. When a family wanted to find a spouse for their child, they would turn to these experts who could facilitate the introduction and negotiations leading up to the marriage. While the concept of love might seem central to our understanding of marriage today, The Victorian era offers a different perspective. Love was not necessarily expected to be the foundation upon which a marriage was built. In fact, it was often believed that love could and should develop after the establishment of the marital bond. Of course, there were exceptions, and many people did fall in love and have their feelings reciprocated. But this was not the norm. It was not uncommon for couples to be introduced to each other through family connections or acquaintances, and then to spend a period of time simply becoming acquainted before any serious discussion of marriage took place. Courtship rituals were also very different back then. They were quite strict, formal, and chaperoned, meaning that a third person, usually a family member, was present during interactions between the couple. Physical contact between unmarried men and women was generally avoided and deemed inappropriate. Therefore, letters, stolen glances, and carefully worded conversations held special significance as a means of expressing romantic interest. A suitor would typically begin by asking for the hand of the woman he was interested in, approaching her parents first to express his intentions. If the initial request was accepted, courtship would commence with the suitor and the woman meeting in the presence of chaperones. During this time, they would engage in polite conversation, exchange compliments, and subtly hint at their affection for each other. The woman was not allowed to initiate courtship. She waited for the man to express his interest, and she could either accept or reject his advances through her behavior and responses. And if all went well, eventually he might pop the question. And if she said yes, congratulations, you're engaged. Now, let's take a deeper dive into the roles and expectations of the Victorian wife and husband. First up, a Victorian wife. Her role in society was primarily defined by her domestic responsibilities, and her behavior was expected to conform to strict moral standards. The cult of domesticity elevated the home into a haven of morality, and the wife was seen as the guardian of its sanctity. She was expected to be pure, pious, submissive, and domestic. Pious meant that she should be deeply religious and moral. Submissive meant that she should obey her husband and follow his lead in all matters. Domestic related to managing the household, including cooking, cleaning, sewing, and caring for children. A wife was expected to devote herself fully to these tasks and to make the happiness of her husband and family her primary focus. Back in the day, legally, a woman had almost no rights once she got hitched. Everything she owned, including money and property, became her husband's property as soon as they tied the knot. This was known as the doctrine of coverture. However, things started to change with the Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882. These acts gave wives the right to own and control some of their property, like money and personal belongings. And get this, they were even allowed to keep their own earnings from paid work. This was a big step towards gender equality. Still, women's rights activists kept fighting for more equal rights, and we're still working towards that today. Next, let's discuss the role of the Victorian husband. He was considered the head of the household, both legally and morally. This meant that he had ultimate authority over his wife and children, and was responsible for making important decisions for the family. Husbands were expected to provide for their families financially and to protect them emotionally and physically. They were expected to be strong, successful, and dependable. Unlike their wives, husbands had more freedom when it came to engaging in romantic pursuits. However, they were still expected to behave discreetly and not engage in activities that could bring shame or scandal upon their family. Victorian men could be unfaithful and have mistresses without getting divorced. Divorce was really hard to get back then. Let's talk about some of the problems associated with marriage during the Victorian era. One of the most disturbing aspects of marriage in Victorian times was the prevalence of marital rape. This was not recognized as a crime, and there were no legal protections in place to safeguard a woman's right to bodily autonomy within marriage. Women were often trapped in unhappy marriages because leaving or getting divorced was nearly impossible unless you had a lot of money to support yourself and the children. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 made divorce more accessible, but it was still a lengthy, expensive, and socially stigmatized process. Now let's talk about some notable trends and practices related to marriage and courtship. First up, sentimental tokens. Ah, the ultimate expression of love, right? Victorian lovers exchanged all sorts of mementos to express their affection. Think locks of hair, pressed flowers, and mourning jewelry. These tokens were not only a way to show love, but also served as tangible reminders of past encounters or absent loved ones. Secret affairs. Due to the strict societal restrictions placed on courtship and marriage, especially for women, secret affairs were not uncommon. These were romantic or sexual relationships that were kept hidden from the public eye. The constraints of the Victorian social order sometimes drove couples to seek intimacy and secrecy, resulting in clandestine meetings and concealed affairs. Marriage ads? Yep, you heard that right. People put ads in newspapers to find their perfect match. This was actually a thing during the Victorian era. These ads were a unique way of seeking companionship in marriage. Individuals of all social classes could place ads describing their qualities and the type of partner they were looking for. It was an early form of matchmaking, allowing people to bypass traditional methods of finding a spouse. And that's a wrap on marriage and love in Victorian life. Remember, if you learned something new, please share what you discovered with your friends and consider subscribing for more historical insights. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the past. See you later. Let's continue our exploration of Victorian life with a look at love, sex, and marriage. As we examine the relationship between these three institutions, keep in mind that publicly expressing much emotion was considered vulgar. So while there was a lot of flowery language in Victorian love letters, most people saved their most intimate thoughts for private diaries. These writings reveal a much more passionate side to the age than the stiff drawing room conversations with polite smiles would indicate. Before we jump in, give this video a thumbs up, and let's jump right in. One of the first things you need to know about the Victorians is that they were master letter writers. For example, Penelope, Lady Oakley, wrote to her lover, Lord Granville, every day for 5 years while her husband was away. When he died, she continued writing to him in her diary. Now let's take a look at the typical courtship. A young lady was usually presented to society for the purpose of finding a suitable husband when she was 17 or 18 years old. This would involve going to parties and balls, meeting eligible young men, and being seen in public with them. If the couple decided they wanted to get engaged, they would typically announce their engagement before the wedding took place. After the engagement, but before the wedding, a young man was expected to call on his fiancée's family and present them with a formal proposal of marriage. The bride's mother would then arrange for the wedding to take place. Now, let's look at how love was expressed. It was done very subtly and often required an extensive system of winks, nods, and smiles. In fact, many young ladies felt that the art of flirting was one of the skills they needed to learn. But don't worry, we've got you covered. We'll teach you everything you need to know about Victorian flirting in just a moment. But first, let's talk about some interesting things to know about courtship and love. First, never mind Tinder, the Victorians had it way worse. They had to deal with mamas. Mothers had a lot of say in who their daughters married, since financially they were counting on the dowry to support them in their old age. Sometimes a mama would even put her daughter up on a pedestal and parade her around society in hopes that someone would marry her. So much for organic romance. Second, if you thought double standards were bad now, just wait until you hear about the Victorians. Women were expected to be modest and passive when it came to showing affection, while men were allowed to boldly ask a lady for a dance or compliment her beauty. Just think about that for a second. Third, forget ghosting. During the Victorian era, there was a phenomenon known as throwing a ring. It happened when a man would propose to a woman and she would accept, but then later change her mind. This must have been a nightmare scenario for the guy. Imagine getting rejected right before the wedding and having to return the ring. And fourth, speaking of rings, they weren't actually invented during the Victorian period. They've been around since ancient Egypt. However, they did become popular during this time and were often given as a symbol of eternal love. So you're interested in dating a Victorian gentleman or gentlewoman? Well, here asks how to act so that you don't end up thrown out on the street without your ring. First, if you're a man, you can show your interest in a woman by tipping your hat or bowing in a particular way. And don't even think about glancing at her for more than 2 seconds. That was positively scandalous. You also can't go up to her and ask her to dance. That was considered too forward. Instead, you'll have to wait until someone asks you. If you're a woman, your options are limited. The only way you can express your interest in a man is by dropping your handkerchief or fan. But don't even think about doing that unless you want to send a clear message that you're available. Finally, if you're looking to break off an engagement, you've got to do it delicately. Men should offer a sincere but brief explanation and avoid any mention of physical attraction. Women, on the other hand, should just say that they aren't feeling well and leave it at that. Now let's talk about what happened behind closed doors after the wedding. Despite the romantic notion surrounding marriage, the reality was that it was primarily an economic and social institution. In fact, there was a joke during the time that said that half of a woman's prayers after her marriage were for her husband's money. And there was truth to that because for most people, marriage meant joining 2 families and their resources together. But once the wedding was over, the newlyweds were on their own to make the marriage work. And that wasn't always easy, especially when it came to intimacy. See, the ideal wife was supposed to be modest and passive in bed, so much so that some manuals actually told women to lie back and think of England. Meanwhile, husbands were expected to take the lead and be strong providers for their wives. However, that ideal didn't always match up with reality. In fact, sexual ignorance was widespread, especially among upper-class girls who were often shielded from any talk of sex at all. As a result, many brides had no idea what to expect on their wedding night and were totally unprepared for it. What's more, men were allowed to have some premarital experience, but women were expected to be absolutely chaste until they were married. If you're thinking that sounds a bit unfair, you're not alone. But it was the Victorian mindset, and they believed that if a woman was sexually active before marriage, she was less valuable on the marriage market. So what if you're a Victorian man and you find yourself attracted to the same sex? While there were laws against homosexuality, Oscar Wilde was famous for his wit and his lifestyle. His flamboyant dress and his relationship with a younger man named Lord Alfred Douglas caught the attention of the public and the press. When Wilde's former lover testified against him in court, it led to Wilde's downfall and imprisonment in 1895. His case became a cause célèbre, and he was seen as a martyr for the gay rights movement. Ah, yes, the Victorians. They certainly had their own ideas about what was proper and what wasn't. But what about love? It was common for couples to be married for several years before they started a family. This gave them time to adjust to married life and establish a home together before having children. And speaking of children, they were seen as a duty of marriage rather than the fruit of passion. In fact, couples often had 6 to 10 children during this time. Unfortunately, romantic affection between spouses sometimes waned after the birth of a child, especially if the woman was weakened by repeated pregnancies. However, having a baby wasn't the only way to spice up a marriage. Some couples found other ways to keep the passion alive, such as taking secret trips together or writing each other love letters. But don't worry, we won't tell anyone your little secrets. Now let's finish with some fun facts about Victorian love and marriage. First, it was common for people to keep photographs of their dead spouses on the mantelpiece as a memento. It was also common for widows to wear black for 2 years after their husband's death and not remarry quickly without facing public judgment. Finally, the phrase, "she has a nervous condition," was often used to mask a woman who was suffering from sexual frustration, depression, or even domestic abuse. Now it's time for you to share your thoughts. What did you find most interesting about Victorian love and marriage? And what surprised you the most? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more. Until next time. How can we talk about Victorian love without talking about all the weird crap they did to try to make it last? So grab your reticule, pull up a chair, and let's dig through some of their most colorful customs, superstitions, and bigamy. It's gonna be a lot, just so we're clear. This video is being sponsored by Masterworks, an online platform created by a team of art experts and tech innovators. They want to open up access to fine art investment to everyone, not just the ultra-wealthy. Since 2017, Masterworks has sold 3 multi-million-dollar offerings of contemporary art and distributed over $61 million to their investors. Now, I don't know anything about art. My parents still call me Little Picasso. I mean, I do have opinions, but the process of buying and selling art has always seemed like a complicated, exclusive process, even intimidating. That's why I'm excited to partner with Masterworks, because they take all the intimidation out of investing in fine art. Their vetting process is rigorous. They won't sell you anything they wouldn't buy themselves. If you're interested in signing up, go to Masterworks. F/my channel and join the waitlist. You can also check out the sales section where you can find paintings listed under $25K. When you invest in Masterworks, you'll receive shares equal to the percentage of the painting's value that you invest. The rest is on them. Then Masterworks will hold onto your artwork in their secure facility until it's time to sell. As soon as the sale price target is met or exceeded, the money comes back to you. Over the past few months, I've been able to invest in some incredible pieces. Not only are these artists incredibly talented, but it's amazing to support their work. Check out Masterworks and see for yourself. Go to Masterworks. F/my channel to get on the waitlist today. Thank you, Masterworks, for sponsoring this video. The Victorians. A culture whose members seemingly couldn't look each other in the eyes without blushing profusely, yet had zero qualms about sending love poems via ferret post. This era was a time when the slightest display of affection in public could result in fainting spells, forced marriages, and one unfortunate case of sodomy involving a nun and a statue of Christ. So let us take a lighthearted deep dive into a few of their weirder customs surrounding love and marriage. While we usually think of the Victorian age as gloomy and oppressive, the reality was that they loved nothing more than a good party. And nowhere was this more true than on their special day, when etiquette dictated that there must be copious amounts of cake, alcohol, and a 5-course meal featuring both oysters and kidneys. Though sometimes those celebrations took a bizarre turn, as with the case of Mrs. George Ward, who wrote in her diary on her wedding day, "The party broke up at 3:30. No dancing except at the church." How very odd. We had a great deal of wine. I drank a great deal, but I really felt no effects of it. I am afraid we were looked upon as stupid. But even if the reception wasn't as raucous as planned, the food itself was a spectacle. Weddings featured dishes like grilled mutton kidneys with mint sauce, roasted veal patties, stewed eels, and jellied kensong. And the groom's family had to bring their own liquor because the bride's family wasn't allowed to serve hard stuff. There was even a tradition of serving cordial, basically sugar water mixed with brandy, which was especially popular among lower classes. One woman recalled her family rationing the drinks so carefully that a cup was divided between two children and passed round several times before the ceremony began. But while the food and festivities were important, Victorians knew that none of that mattered if the couple didn't exchange vows with perfect timing. Why? Well, partly because they were superstitious enough that there were entire books dedicated to wedding day superstitions. Mary and May rue the day. If a spider falls on the bride, shift good luck. If a dog barks furiously at the church, there'll be death in the family. And rain on the wedding day was generally unlucky unless it happened during the kiss, in which case it meant fertile unions. So the pressure was on for that kiss. Also, there was a lot of pressure to get married in the first place. And not just because single women were constantly on the lookout for a proposal. There were multiple reasons why a wedding needed to happen ASAP. First, there was the fear of spinsterhood, the prospect of being an unmarried woman whose options in life were limited to caring for her family or sewing doilies. Second, there was the fear of poverty, since one of the main purposes of marriage was financial security. Finally, there was the fear of getting too old to bear children, since women were expected to devote their lives to producing heirs. So it's no surprise that marriage proposals could get hasty, as in the case of Lady Annabel Vane Tempest, who received a quick-fire 5-minute proposal while on her way to a party. Her horrified response, "What are you saying?" Speak slowly. "What are you saying?" "Well, you'll never guess what happens next." Yes, the Victorian marriage proposal. Everyone wants to rush through it, whether they're ready or not. What makes it worse is that it's not like you can just say no. For women, refusing a proposal was unthinkable. It was considered a breach of etiquette, and if you were lucky, your mother would step in and politely tell the suitor that you were already engaged to someone else. But if nobody was around, well, you were kinda screwed. Your only option was to agree and hope for the best. But what about after the wedding? Once the deed was done, it was time to settle into married life. But even that came with its own set of strange rules. For example, husbands were supposed to act like kings of their own domain, which meant giving orders, setting the rules, and not having to listen to any back talk. In fact, it was considered unseemly for a wife to even suggest anything, as one woman complained in her journal. "He never asks my opinion of anything, nor does he care for it if I express it of my own accord. He seems to suppose I am merely an inferior being without an opinion of my own." Similarly, husbands were free to hire private investigators to follow their wives to make sure they weren't sneaking around. And if they did find their wife with a secret lover, well, they could legally beat her without any repercussions. Meanwhile, if the wife found the husband with a mistress, she was supposed to accept it gracefully and offer up platitudes like, "All is well." Talk about a recipe for success. But perhaps the most peculiar aspect of Victorian marriage was the secrecy surrounding it. Yes, the ceremonies were very public affairs. But before and after the ceremony, things were kept under wraps. For example, if a husband wanted to show affection to his wife, he had to do it in the most discreet way possible, even a gentle caress could cause a scandal. So instead, they came up with euphemisms and coded language. Here are some common examples. "Don't touch me. I need to powder my face." "My head is not well," or "the wasp again." And once they were wed, it was considered rude to discuss the details of the ceremony or the reception afterwards. Victorians valued decorum above all else, and that included stifling any mention of the wedding. As you may have noticed, Victorian marriages were not exactly hotbeds of romance. But that doesn't mean love didn't exist during this time. It just existed in secret. Perhaps the most touching examples of this are the many secret lovers who went to extreme lengths to communicate with each other. Sometimes they used coded messages hidden inside clothing or furniture. Other times they used fake names or addresses. But one of the most common methods was the humble letter, which could be delivered by anyone from a maidservant to a stray dog. But no matter the method, these lovers were willing to risk everything for a chance to be with each other. And that's pretty romantic, if you ask me. So what do you think? Does Victorian courtship seem like a fairy tale or a nightmare? Let me know in the comments below. And while you're down there, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Thanks for watching.